Well, it is really good to be home. That trip was way too long, but we had a great time. Thank you for letting us go. Got to connect with a lot of family, see some friends, and then we had a surprise along the way. Keenan ended up proposing to his girlfriend, and so our family has a wedding on the horizon here sometime in 2025. So we'll be sharing those details as they come. We're really proud of him, and he did a great job. And we're thrilled with who he found. And Lord willing, I think their current plan is to move out this way and be with us. So hopefully we'll see a lot more of them come the summertime. As we wrap up the year, I really want to end on something hopeful and encouraging, and hopefully something that will be challenging to us as well. We're going to be talking about overcoming with God's promises. I heard somebody was trying to read that title and overcoming God's promises. It's overcoming with God's promises is what we're going to be talking about. And in a little bit, we'll get to 1 Corinthians. But before we do that, I'd like us to start back in Genesis and just do a really quick review of something that I'm confident you already know. When you go back to Genesis chapter 11, it's a chapter of genealogies. And in those genealogies, it's trying to get the text to point toward Abram, Father Abraham. And to do that, it has to explain all of the patriarchs that came before him. And there's this formula that the text uses to summarize their lives. So when you look at verse 10 of Genesis 11, it says, "These are the generations of Shem. When Shem was 100 years old, he fathered Arphaxad 2 years after the flood." So it gives you his age, and it gives you the age that he started having children, specifically when he had the next son in line. So the formula continues in verse 11. Shem lived after he fathered Arphaxad 500 years and had other sons and daughters. Okay, then verse 12. When Arphaxad had lived 35 years, he fathered Shelah. And Arphaxad lived after he had fathered Shelah 403 years and had other sons and daughters. And so you have this formula where you get the age of the father when he had the first son, and then you had his age after that. So you keep going through, and what you start to see is that the average age of these men, when they started having their children, specifically that first son, the average age was usually in the 30s. You look at verse 12, Arphaxad lived 35 years and he had Shelah. And verse 14, when Shelah lived 30 years, he had Eber. Verse 16, when Eber lived 34 years, he had Peleg, and on and on and on. Most of the time it's in the mid-30s. But then you get a unique feature there. In verse 26, when Terah had lived 70 years, he fathered Abram, Nahor, and Haran. And so the father of Abraham didn't have Abraham until he was more than twice the average age, which was unique. And then you go into Abraham. And what you see in all the rest of that chapter, verses 27 through 32 of chapter 11, is Abraham continues childless. He doesn't have any kids. But when you get to chapter 12, you have this really famous section of Genesis where God calls Abram out of the land of Ur and sends him toward the land of Canaan. And so starting in verse 1 of chapter 12, the Lord said to Abram, "Go from your country and your kindred and your father's house to the land that I will show you. And I will make of you a great nation, and I will bless you and make your name great, so that you will be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and him who dishonors you I will curse, and in you all the families of the earth shall be blessed." So Abram went as the Lord had told him, and Lot went with him. Abram was 75 years old when he departed from Haran. No kids. He's 75 years old, but he doesn't have any children yet. But what God had promised in the first couple of verses here is that God was going to bless Abraham with a large family, and through that large family end up blessing everybody. So there's a very big, vague promise, but it hasn't been fulfilled yet. And you get this period of time toward the end of the chapter where Abram and Sarai go down to Egypt, and they sojourn in Egypt for a little bit. And then in chapter 13, he has to go, and 13 and 14, he has to rescue his nephew Lot. And then when you get to chapter 15, God comes and visits Abram. Chapter 15 and verse 1. After these things, the word of the Lord came to Abram in a vision. Fear not, Abram, I am your shield. Your reward shall be very great. But Abram said, O Lord God, what will you give me? For I continue childless. And the heir of my house is Eleazar of Damascus. And Abraham said, Behold, you have given me no offspring, and a member of my household will be my heir. And behold, the word of the Lord came to him, This man shall not be your heir. Your very own son shall be your heir. And then he takes him out and tells him to count the stars if he's able to. And he says, someday your descendants will be as numerous as all those stars that you see there. Now, it's been quite a period of time. From 75 to here, it's been years. And there's still no fulfillment of the promise. But God gets more specific with the promise. Then they get impatient. In Genesis 16, Sarai gets impatient. She still hasn't had any kids, so she tells Abram, hey, why don't you go and start bearing a child with my handmaid, and I'll adopt her child as ours, and we'll just make the promise happen that way. And they end up having Ishmael, and that is not God's plan. God explains to him, hey, Ishmael is not going to be the heir. The heir is going to come from you and from Sarah. Chapter 17 and verse 6, he makes that promise to the two of them. Chapter 18, he gets even more specific and tells Sarah that within a year's time, she's going to bear the child. Eventually, all of that comes to pass. You have, in chapter 21, the birth of Isaac. And the way the text words it is just really beautiful. Starting in verse 1 of Genesis 21. The Lord visited Sarah as he had said, and the Lord did to Sarah as he had promised. And Sarah conceived and bore Abraham a son in his old age at the time when God had spoken to him. Abraham called the name of his son who was born to him, whom Sarah bore him, Isaac. And Abraham circumcised his son Isaac when he was 8 days old, as God had commanded him. Abraham was 100 years old when his son Isaac was born to him. And Sarah said, God has made laughter for me. Everyone who hears will laugh over me. And she said, who would have said to Abraham that Sarah would nurse children? Yet I have borne him a son in his old age. And when you put together a bunch of passages from here in Genesis and then also in the New Testament, you come to understand, especially from Romans, that because of the advanced age of Abraham and Sarah, biologically, they should not have been able to have kids. I mean, she had gone through menopause. Earlier in a couple of chapters, when God visited Sarah, she's like, the way of women is gone from me. Like, I cannot physically have kids anymore. Basically, what she's accusing God of is messing up. You messed this up. I can't bear the child. But what God is trying to help them understand is that God does impossible things. And the one who gets the credit for all of this is God. God does something incredible and helps a barren woman give birth. And so God gets the credit for all of that. But I love the verse in verse 1 of 21. The Lord visited Sarah as he had said, and the Lord did to Sarah as he had promised. Think about some of the other promises that God made and that God kept in the early history of Israel. I'm just going to rattle a few off here. Think about here in Genesis as the text shifts and starts to focus on the life of Joseph. Joseph, we looked at this in our Genesis class just a month or two ago. Joseph received those dreams that he shared with his brothers and he shared with his dad, and they thought that he was being uppity, and they got upset and they got jealous. But really, as you read the story and you look at the bigger picture of the nation of Israel, what God did is he prophesied through Joseph what he would do. And he gave Joseph those dreams as promises to hang on to that he would keep those things someday. So even through the darkness of, being sold into slavery and being put in a prison unfairly, on those dark nights when he was alone, Joseph could hang on to, hey, God promised this thing, and it hasn't happened yet. I need to hang on. He multiplied the Israelites while they were in Egypt. He delivered the Israelites from the bondage of Egypt. He actually led them from Egypt to Jordan twice during their wilderness wanderings. He led Joshua and the Israelites into Canaan to capture the land, and it was the land of promise. It was the land that God had promised to Jacob and his descendants that they would inherit. All through, you have God making promises to his people, and he doesn't always give them the specific time frame, and he doesn't always give them all the details. They just need to trust that God is a God who keeps his promises. He's faithful. And that idea of a faithful God is something that the Hebrew writer records in Hebrews 6:18. So that by two unchangeable things in which it is impossible for God to lie, we who have fled for refuge might have a strong encouragement to hold fast to the hope set before us. The Hebrew writer is saying, hey, think about all the promises that God has given to his people, and remember this fact: God has never failed to keep a one of them. And that's impressive. And so while we wait for God to keep his promises relating to us, we can have confidence in his character and in the precedent that he's already set. Well, what does all of this have to do with 1 Corinthians? We'll turn over to 1 Corinthians chapter 10. And the rest of our time tonight, we're going to be focusing on this text, 1 Corinthians chapter 10. And just to help refresh ourselves about this church was a mess. I mean, Paul, in the very first chapter of 1 Corinthians, is addressing the fact that they are a mess. They're divided, they fight with each other, they have their preferred teachers and preachers within the group, they hold one teacher over the other, and you all don't do that with me and Jerry, like we're both equally great, okay? But they had that. They had this infighting and this system, and they had different ideas, and they were fighting over miraculous spiritual gifts, which one was better and who had which. And it was just, they weren't waiting for each other during the Lord's Supper. And you could just go on and on. They had the guy that was with his father's wife. There was gross immorality. It was a mess. And so Paul is writing to this church that Jesus still claims as his, and he's trying to put it in order. And he's trying to help them realize, hey, you all need to be doing better. And I think if you were to skip ahead to chapter 13 in that section on love, that really encapsulates everything that they needed to do. If they were to love each other more and think of themselves less, most of those problems would have resolved themselves. But one of the things he has to address as he gets to chapter 10 is this idea of not being faithful to God, of having competing alliances, specifically idolatry. And so he uses the Old Testament example of the Israelites. So starting in verse 1 of chapter 10, Paul wrote this to that church. I want you to know, brothers, that our fathers were all under the cloud, and all passed through the sea. All were baptized into Moses in the cloud and in the sea. And all ate the same spiritual food, and all drank the same spiritual drink, for they drank from the spiritual rock that followed them, and the rock was Christ. Nevertheless, with most of them, God was not pleased, for they were overthrown in the wilderness. Let me just summarize that for a second. He's asking them to think about the generation of Israelites that came up out of Egypt. And he says they all had a common salvation experience, okay? They were all under the cloud, the pillar of cloud and the pillar of fire that was leading them, the presence of God. He's like, all of them were following the same cloud. All of them passed through the walls of the Red Sea to escape from the chariots of Pharaoh. All of them ate the manna. All of them ate the quail. All of them drank the water that God miraculously provided. All of them benefited in all of those ways. But, in verse 5, nevertheless, with most of them, God was not pleased, for they were overthrown in the wilderness. There's a caution that he's throwing out here. What he's saying is, look, just because you've experienced common blessings from God doesn't inherently mean that you're okay with God. I mean, think about that for a second. We need to be sober about that, and we need to look at ourselves and examine ourselves. Just because I say I've been saved the way I ought to be saved, and I worship the way that I ought to worship, and I do some of the things that God tells me to do, I can't just place my confidence in these externals. Because all of these people, this huge mass of people, they were like, yep, God's happy with me. And the truth was, no, he wasn't. Because their hearts weren't in it, and that came up several times along the trip. So look at verse 6. These things took place as examples for us, that we might not desire evil as they did. And he's about to give some more examples. Do not be idolaters, as some of them were. As it is written, the people sat down to eat and drink and rose up to play. Do you know where that quote is coming from? It's coming from Exodus 32 and the incident with the golden calf. Like, while Moses was up with Joshua on the mountain getting the Ten Commandments from God, they're at Mount Sinai for the first time getting their law as a people. Aaron is down at the base of the mountain leading them in idolatrous worship. But they had all been through the Red Sea. They had all escaped the plagues. They had all been giving blessings. See, that's the point that he's making. We need to make sure that we're faithful in our allegiance to God and learn from their example. Don't do that. Look at verse 8. We must not indulge in sexual immorality as some of them did, and 23,000 fell in a single day. He's talking about Balaam's curse. Verse 9, we must not put Christ to the test, as some of them did, and were destroyed by the serpents, back in Numbers, when they were dissatisfied with the manna. Verse 10, don't grumble, as some of them did, and were destroyed by the destroyer, talking about Korah's rebellion. So he's just giving examples and challenging the Christians there at Corinth. Hey, don't hang all of your hope in the externals. Make sure that your heart is focused and loyal to God, and don't give in to idolatry in all these different forms. He's really warning them. Anybody can give in to idolatry. Anybody can do it. Verse 11, now these things happened to them as an example, but they were written down for our instruction, on whom the end of ages has come. There's some really powerful ideas in there. He's saying, there's a lot more that God could have written down and recorded for us in his Bible. But he chose the ones that made the cut for our benefit. We needed to learn the lessons of their lives and their examples, both positive and negative. These are negative. And then he says we needed to hear it because the end of all of God's plan has culminated in Jesus and in the age that comes after Jesus. It's the age that we're living in. And then he warns us in verse 12, therefore let anyone who thinks he stands take heed lest he fall. It'd be really easy to think, we're at this final stage of God's salvation history where he was pointing to Jesus, and then Jesus showed up, and now there's these generations on the other side of the cross, which include us. And if we're not careful, we could get a really big head and think, wow, we've got it all. We've got the complete Bible. We see things that the previous generations only had hints about, and there's some truth in that. But if we're not careful, we're going to get a really big head and think that we're stronger or better, or somehow we're not going to be tempted like those previous generations. That's simply not true. And so when you get to verse 13, how does all of this come together? In verse 13, Paul reminds people, if you're humble and you're careful about this, you want to overcome those temptations to idolatry. Well, how am I going to do that? And what he says in verse 13 is he gives you 4 promises that God makes. And he's saying that you can overcome temptations and trials by these 4 promises. So let's talk through verse 13. He says, "No temptation has overtaken you that is not common to man. God is faithful, and he will not let you be tempted beyond your ability, but with the temptation he will also provide the way of escape, that you may be able to endure it." Let's focus on that first phrase, because in that first phrase, we have the first promise. No temptation has overtaken you that is not common to man. And that word temptation, depending on the context, is either translated temptation or it's translated trial. And there's a difference between the two, but they're usually linked together. Okay, here in the context of 1 Corinthians 10, the idea of temptation is there's this thing outside of you that appeals to you. There's this thing that you're tempted to place above God. And so you sin when you give in to that temptation, when you do what God says not to do, when you choose that thing that God says you really shouldn't choose. That's a temptation, and you have to decide, am I going to give in to the temptation or not? A trial is something that you don't necessarily choose. It happens to you. It puts pressure on you. But the two can go together. Sometimes trials produce temptations. And depending on the temptation that you give into, it will lead to trials. See how they're linked? So they're distinct, but they're connected. And what he's saying here is that there is no temptation that has overtaken you that is not common to man. What that means is, whatever you're being tempted with, someone, somewhere, has been tempted by it before. What's the big deal about that? Like, that sounds really obvious. If one of my kids said that, I might be slightly sarcastic and say, "Thank you, Captain Obvious." Like, what's the benefit of stating something so simple? And I think this is the benefit. When we're not careful, when we're facing a temptation or a trial, and it just keeps after us and it keeps after us, if we're not careful, we can tend to think, man, I'm the only one. I'm the only one who feels this. I'm the only one who's tempted by this. I'm the only one that wants to give in to this. And no one else can understand what I'm going through, so I can't share with them. And kind of like a bunch of herd animals, we get singled out from the herd, and Satan's just got us because we think we're the only one. The truth is, what God is trying to say is, you're not alone in your temptation. You're not alone in your trial. You never were. There are other people that can sympathize with you and encourage you and help you and strengthen you and help hold you accountable, and you can do the same for them, but you're only going to do it if you actually believe this promise. You're not alone. You think about anybody that's trying to overcome a habitual temptation. You know, somebody that has developed some kind of habit, and one of the things that we want to communicate with those folks is, you can't do this alone. You need someone to help hold you accountable. You need someone to talk with. You need someone to reach out to. You need a mentor. You need all kinds of things. The point is, don't do it alone. God says you're not alone. Right? Whatever you're going through, Satan wants you to think and feel like you're the only one. The truth is, you have others that can help. And along the way, you'll help them. No temptation has overtaken you that is not common to man. God is faithful. That's a promise. God is faithful. God keeps his promises. And you can trust everything that he says. Remember everything that we looked at with Abraham and the promise of his son? And the 25 years. It took 25 years from the first vague promise to the birth of Isaac. And it took reviewing that promise and getting more specific along the way to help Abraham and to encourage him. And he wasn't always content with God's timing. But eventually, after 25 years, God when Abraham had nothing left to do and Sarah had nothing left to offer, is when God kept his promise and glorified himself. Right? You think about whatever it is that you're going through, look up passages that are relevant to what your specific trial is or your specific temptation is, and any of those verses that God has recorded and inspired there, he's going to keep those promises. Go back to verse 13. God is faithful, and he will not let you be tempted beyond your ability. He will not let you be tempted beyond your ability. This illustration I really came to appreciate when I was in high school. Because some buddies and I started working out regularly a couple of times a week, and we'd go to the gym by ourselves. One of us had a car, so we could go without our parents. And we had our family memberships, so we didn't need them to get in, and we were old enough to be left in the weight room unattended. That was questionable. But we went to the gym, and we'd work out a couple of times a week, and we were young and we were dumb, and we thought that we were invincible and we could do all kinds of things. Someone finally convinced us that we needed to start using spotters, which was such a great idea. We would have really hurt ourselves if we hadn't started using spotters. And we loved the idea of working out to the point of failure. You really had to trust your buddy, thinking that your buddy could catch you, or else a dumbbell was going to come and crush your neck or crush your chest or whatever. I think there was one brother that we let struggle a little bit longer than we needed to, but he needed to learn that lesson anyway. Think about God like that. Think about God like your buddy in the weight room who's spotting you. He's the guy that's standing behind you as you're trying to do a bench press, and he's got his hands underneath the bar, and he knows, based on his experience with you, what your current capacity is. And so he knows that as you're pushing up and you're straining your muscles and you've got the weights on either side, he knows what your current capacity is and how many reps you ought to be able to do. And he knows, because he knows you, he's not going to let you put too much weight on there. And he's not going to intervene before he should. He's going to let you strain and struggle and get stronger. But he also knows that when the failure kicks in, he's going to be there to catch you and to make sure that you don't do irreparable harm to yourself. I mean, think about that. Like, what if I took Felicity to the gym? Do you think I'm just going to let her jump up there with 200 pounds and tell her to bench it? I mean, that'd be funny to watch her try to unrack that, but she's not even going to get it off the rack. I know my 7-year-old. And as her father, I'm going to help her try to do the best that she can do, but I'm not going to let her hurt herself. Okay? What God is saying here, what Paul is revealing here about God, is that God is not going to let you be tempted beyond your ability. And I have met Christians who laugh when I say that. You might be doing it in your head right now. Because you have got a scenario in your brain, you're like, well, if God wouldn't let me be tempted beyond my ability, then how come I'm facing this? How come this happened? How come, and why does it feel so overwhelming? Because there's a caveat that's implied in the whole thing. Do you know how spotters work? If you let them work. You can go to the gym and bench press all you want and not have a spotter. If you want to do that, if you want to run life that way, you can run life that way, and you're going to hurt yourself. But if you go and do it and let God do what God wants to do for you, if you let God help, you're going to be okay. The caveat is this: He will not let you be tempted beyond your ability as long as you let Him. If you run away from God's care and go and act a fool and go and do all kinds of crazy things and ignore Him and pretend like He's not around, then you are going to make a royal wreck out of your life, because He's going to respect your free will. But if you will rely on Him and humble yourself and listen to Him and come back and ask for His intervention, it's going to go so much better no matter what you face. So, the promises so far to help us avoid temptation is to remember you are not alone. God is faithful, And God is helping. Whether you recognize it or not, God is there, ready and willing to spot for you and to rebuke you and encourage you and warn you and anything that he needs to do for your benefit. Now, there's a fourth promise. The fourth promise is at the end of the verse, that you may be able to endure it. I don't know how long some of those trials or those temptations are going to last. I don't know. Some are shorter, some are longer. Just like the Israelites didn't have any idea how long some of their journeys were going to be, Abraham didn't know how many years it would be before God kept his promise about Isaac. Like, there are some things about duration and time that God does not reveal. Sometimes he did. Sometimes he did say, hey, 70 years in captivity. Sometimes he did say that. More often than not, that amount of time was usually left blank. But the point that Paul is making here is, no matter what that length of time, there's always a way to endure. There is always a way to endure. There's always a way to overcome. And he's not just running his mouth about that. Think about Paul and all of the things that he faced, all of the things that he suffered for the case of Christ. When you go over to 2 Corinthians chapter 12, and he starts rattling off about his thorn in the flesh. That thorn in the flesh was a trial, and I'm sure it produced some temptations. And he specifically prayed to God multiple times for that thorn in the flesh, whatever it was, to be removed. And God's answer was no. His fuller answer was, my grace is sufficient for you. What you need is more of my grace, not to have this thing taken away. So, if we're going to overcome the way we ought to overcome, we need to remember that we are not alone, that God is faithful, that he's helping, and there is always a way to overcome. It all starts with making sure that he's your Savior and he's your Lord first. And I appreciate the songs that Blake has chosen for us tonight to focus on victory. Because hopefully, as we come into 2025, you'll experience even more victory over whatever trials and whatever temptations you're facing. But you can only start that if you experience victory over sin and victory over death by becoming a Christian, dying in Christ and being baptized into him. If there's somebody that needs to respond to the gospel tonight, please do so while we stand and while we sing.